I believe most people would agree that there's nothing like a good party to add a little spice to life. This was certainly true in first century Palestine, where most people lived in difficult times, laboring day after day. Once in a while, the dreary cycle of work and eat and sleep was broken by a wedding feast. A feast that would have involved the whole community, and a feast that would have lasted a number of days. This is the scene of our gospel today as we reflect upon the wedding feast of Cana. Imagine the murmuring of the crowd when word began to spread that the wine had run out. Just when things should be at their happiest, celebrating the gift of a new family, the wine jugs run dry. Once Mary hears that the wine is gone, she instinctively turns to her son. Having lived in the same household for some 30 years, she knew that Jesus would do what was needed to respond to the crying need. Maybe there was something in communication between mother and son that St. John couldn't quite put into words, that body language between two people who know each other so well that they can communicate in ways without using words. That certain smile, a look, a small gesture is enough to convey the message. Mary says they have no wine. Jesus says, "Woman, how does your concern affect me?" To an outsider, this response may appear unkind, but maybe it came with the smile or a look on his face that told Mary that he would do what she asked him to do. And that's why Mary simply said to the servers, "Do whatever he tells you to do." The same God who keeps the heavens and the earth in motion is also concerned about the worldly problems of a wedding feast that has run out of wine. With this miracle of the wedding feast of Cana, we can see that God lovingly inserts himself into our daily lives, and he responds with an abundance that's beyond what we could imagine. Something as ordinary as a shortage of wine becomes a sign of God's abundance, God's care for us in the ordinariness of life. This miracle comes in the second chapter of John's Gospel. Early on in his Gospel, we're given a glimpse of the power of God at work, transforming ordinary life. Ordinary water becomes a rich, choice wine. Ordinary people will become faithful disciples. Ordinary wine will become the blood of Christ. And then we will see that the darkness of death opens the way to the bright promise of everlasting life. What we see in John's Gospel is that ongoing transformation is key to a spiritual life. This image is found in our first reading from the prophet Isaiah. Even when things looked hopeless, after years of captivity, the Israelites were back home in Jerusalem, but their city was demolished. Their life was hard. They were discouraged and depressed. Isaiah the prophet offers the people a vision full of hope. And he uses the image of marriage to speak of the intimate love and trust that God has for his people. When we are left to human power alone, we will always come up short. But when we allow God's life, God's power to be at work within us, then there's an abundance that will satisfy every need. One way the abundance of God is revealed to us is through the gifts of the Spirit identified by St. Paul. the gifts of wisdom and healing and prophecy, the gifts of teaching and mighty deeds and discernment. These are but a few of the many gifts of the Spirit, gifts that the Spirit gives to individuals for the benefit of the whole community. There is no gift that we have that is of our own making, and there is no gift that is better than any of the other gifts. They are all from God's Spirit. And when we share the spiritual gifts, we are blessed to receive then the abundance of God's grace. Working together, there's a beauty that comes forth in life. Anyone who cooks knows that the secret of a good stew is found in the sauce. In a stew, you put together water and carrots and potatoes and onions and celery and salt and beef. But you don't just leave it in that pan and sit there. It has to be heated up. It has to boil a bit. In the cooking process, then, each of the ingredients gives up a little of its flavor to make the sauce very beautiful and unique. Now, while the sauce shares in each of those parts, the flavors of all those veggies, you can tell each one yet. They don't lose their individual characteristic or quality. It's a beautiful image of what community life is all about. When each of us shares our talents, when each of us shares a bit of ourselves, even when there's struggles and sometimes relationships can get to a boiling point, we stay with it and we seek to find the truth that God wants us to know. As we share a little of ourselves, our lives are enriched, and we begin to see the abundance of God's mercy and love. As we share God's love, God's grace, our world is transformed more and more into the original dream God had in mind for us and for our world. And just as the choice wine Jesus made was served at the end of the wedding feast of Cana, so too the Lord is saving the best for last when we join him in the great wedding feast of heaven. Whenever we live in union with Jesus and in union with one another, God's grace sustains us with gifts beyond measure. And through the divine life we share, we all know the best is yet to come.